His throne came with a curse. Aurora Derasi had spent years pretending she didn't know the truth. But when she uncovered a secret she was never meant to find, she made the mistake of thinking she could run. And now, Tommaso Benedetti stood in her doorway, his smirk slow and knowing. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Now, I'll make sure you never run again." Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage Cracks. The scent of aged wood and lemon blossoms, usually so comforting, felt cloying, suffocating. Aurora Derasi traced the intricate carvings on the antique writing desk, her fingers lingering on a small, almost imperceptible crack in the veneer. It mirrored the fissures that had begun to spiderweb across the seemingly perfect surface of her life. 62 years, and she was only now truly seeing the gilded cage she'd inhabited. Her reflection in the polished surface stared back a woman with silver threading through once raven hair, eyes that held a deep, abiding sadness, and a mouth that had learned to smile even when her heart ached. The fine lines etched around her eyes weren't just from age, they were the cartography of unshed tears, of silences kept, of truths ignored. She'd been the dutiful daughter, the compliant wife, the grieving widow. La Vedova Derasi, the respectful title whispered in the hushed tones of the grand palazzos and echoing through the cobbled streets of their ancient Florentine neighborhood. Her husband, Lorenzo, had been a powerful man, respected, feared, even loved, in his own way. A man of connections. Connections she'd deliberately, meticulously, avoided understanding. Lorenzo had died 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack, they said. A swift, clean end for a man who'd lived a life that was anything but. Aurora had mourned him. Yes, but it was a mourning tinged with a peculiar relief, a subtle loosening of chains she hadn't even realized she'd been wearing. The chains of expectation, of tradition, of fear. The silence in the sprawling villa was deafening. It had always been a quiet house, even when Lorenzo was alive. Their only child, Marco, had died young. A tragic accident, another wound that had never fully healed. The staff, a handful of loyal, long-serving retainers, moved like shadows, their presence barely registering. They knew their place, knew the unspoken rules. Discretion was valued above all else. It was the discovery earlier that day that had finally cracked the facade. Aurora had been searching for Lorenzo's old will, a tedious task undertaken at the insistence of her lawyer. She'd found it, tucked away in a hidden compartment behind a false panel in a study, a room she'd rarely entered during his life, a room that still held the faint, lingering scent of his expensive cigars and something else, something darker, something she couldn't quite name. But it wasn't the will that had caught her attention. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Lorenzo's meticulous handwriting. Not the usual business dealings, the accounts, the names she'd expected. This was different. This was personal. And terrifying. Names she recognized, names whispered in fear, names connected to other families. Families who were not friends. Families who were rivals. And interspersed among those names, a recurring phrase, a code, perhaps, that sent a chill down her spine. Il prezzo del tradimento. The price of betrayal. And then her own name, Aurora. Written not with affection, but with a chilling detachment, alongside a date, a time, a place. A meeting she'd never attended, a conversation she'd never had. A lie. A carefully constructed, meticulously maintained lie. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. The world she thought she knew, the life she believed in, had shattered into a million pieces. Lorenzo hadn't just been a businessman with connections. He'd been something else. Something far more dangerous. And she, Aurora, had been a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. A sudden noise, the faint click of the front door opening, startled her. It was too early for Isabella, the housekeeper, to return from the market. Aurora's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic bird trapped in the gilded cage. She quickly slipped the journal back into its hiding place, her fingers clumsy with fear. She rose from the desk, smoothing down the wrinkles in her silk dress, a reflex, a lifetime of maintaining appearances, even when her world was crumbling around her. She walked towards the doorway, her steps measured, her posture regal, the mask of La Vedova de Rossi firmly in place. As she stepped into the grand hallway, bathed in the soft, golden light filtering through the stained glass windows, she saw him. A figure silhouetted against the doorway, tall, imposing, a shadow from a past she'd tried so hard to forget. Tommaso Benedetti. His name, even unspoken, was a whisper of danger, a promise of retribution. The Benedetti and the de Rossi families had a history, a long, bloody feud that stretched back generations. A feud that Lorenzo had supposedly ended, a truce he'd supposedly brokered. Another lie. He hadn't aged as gracefully as she had. His dark hair was streaked with more silver, his face was harsher, lined with the cruelty of his profession, the ruthlessness of his bloodline. But his eyes were the same. Dark, piercing, intense, eyes that saw everything, eyes that missed nothing. Eyes that held a flicker of something that made her breath catch in her throat. Not hatred, not entirely. Something else. He stepped fully into the hallway, the sunlight catching the glint of a gold ring on his finger, a serpent coiled around a sword, the Benedetti family crest. A symbol of power, of danger, of inevitability. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. The endearment, Dulcezza, sweetheart, felt like a threat, a mockery. Aurora stood her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. Years of pretending, of hiding, of suppressing her fear, had taught her how to mask her emotions. But beneath the surface, a tremor of fear, raw and primal, threatened to consume her. "Tommaso," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" He took another step closer, invading her personal space, the scent of his cologne, a blend of expensive leather and something darker, something untamed, filling her senses. He was close enough for her to see the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a memento from a long-ago battle, a reminder of the violence that was woven into the fabric of his being. "You know why I'm here, Aurora," he said softly, his voice a silken whisper that was more menacing than a shout. "You took something that doesn't belong to you. Something that could unravel everything." She knew he wasn't talking about the journal. He was talking about the truth. The truth she'd stumbled upon, the truth that threatened to expose not only Lorenzo's secrets, but the entire intricate web of lies and betrayals that held their world together. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was a futile attempt, she knew, but she had to try. She had to protect something. Herself? Her family's legacy? She wasn't sure anymore. His smile widened, a cruel, predatory glint in his eyes. "Don't insult my intelligence, Aurora. We both know you're lying. You always were a terrible liar." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and threatening. Now, his voice dropped, raw with a promise of violence barely contained. "I'll make sure you never run again." Where was Isabella? Why hadn't she heard the car? A chilling thought settled in Aurora's stomach. Had Tommaso dealt with her? Chapter 2. Whispers in the Palazzo. The silence that followed Tommaso's words was thick with unspoken threats. Aurora's mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, a solution, anything to break the suffocating tension. Her gaze darted to the ornate grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging with a steady, rhythmic tick-tock, a mocking reminder of the dwindling time she had. "Isabella," Aurora said, her voice stronger than she felt, injecting a note of forced normalcy into the fraught atmosphere. "Please bring Signor Benedetti some refreshment. Perhaps some of your excellent espresso?" It was a gamble, a test. If Isabella didn't appear, it would confirm her worst fears. If she did well, it would buy her a few precious moments, a chance to think, to plan. Tommaso's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking towards the hallway leading to the kitchen, then back to Aurora. He didn't answer, didn't move, his presence a solid, immovable wall between her and any hope of escape. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Aurora could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the frantic beat of her own heart. She forced herself to maintain eye contact with Tommaso, refusing to show any outward sign of her fear. It was a skill she'd honed over years of living with Lorenzo, a mask of composure she'd worn so often it felt almost like a second skin. Finally, after what felt like an hour, Isabella appeared, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Aurora's own. She carried a silver tray, the delicate porcelain cups rattling slightly in her trembling hands. "Signor Benedetti," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Forgive me, I didn't hear you arrive." Tommaso gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving Aurora's. "Espresso."
"Black. No sugar."
Isabella hurried to serve him, her movements clumsy, her usual grace replaced by a palpable nervousness. Aurora watched, her mind working furiously. Isabella's fear was genuine, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of understanding? Complicity? As Isabella handed Tommaso his espresso, their fingers brushed, and Aurora saw a tiny, almost imperceptible nod pass between them. A secret exchange, a silent communication. It was then that Aurora realized Isabella wasn't a victim. She was a player. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Isabella, who had been with the family for over 30 years, who had helped raise Marco, who had been a constant, comforting presence in Aurora's life, was working with Tommaso. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. It was a confirmation of everything she'd suspected, everything she'd feared. She was alone. Completely and utterly alone. Tommaso took a sip of his espresso, his eyes still locked on Aurora's. He savored the moment, the taste of victory, the knowledge that he had her cornered. "Delicious," he said, his voice smooth, his smile predatory. Isabella always did have a talent for pleasing. The double entendre was not lost on Aurora. It was a deliberate taunt, a reminder of his power, his control. "Now, Aurora," he said, setting the cup down on the tray with a delicate click. "Let's talk about the journal." Aurora forced herself to meet his gaze, her mask of composure cracking slightly. "I told you, I don't know what you're talking about." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You always were a stubborn woman, Aurora. It's one of the things I admired about you." The word admired hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a reminder of the past, of the time before the feud, before the betrayal, before the hatred. A time when they had been something else. Aurora remembered a young Tommaso, his eyes full of fire, his smile full of mischief. A Tommaso who had courted her, secretly, passionately, defying the ancient animosity between their families. A Tommaso who had promised her the world, a future filled with love and happiness. A future that had been shattered by Lorenzo. The memory, sharp and painful, brought a lump to her throat. She had loved Tommaso once, with a fierce, reckless passion that had defied all logic, all reason. But that love had been poisoned, twisted, destroyed by the machinations of their families, by the weight of tradition, by the inescapable reality of their world. "That was a long time ago, Tommaso," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "We were different people then." "Were we?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. "Or were we simply playing the roles assigned to us?" It was a question that resonated deep within Aurora's soul. Had they ever truly been free to choose their own destiny? Or had they always been puppets, dancing to the tune of their family's ancient feud? "I don't want to talk about the past," she said, turning away from him, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "But the past is what brought us here, Aurora," he said, his voice following her. "The past is what dictates the present. And the future." He moved closer, his presence filling the room, his scent enveloping her. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "The journal, Aurora," he repeated, his voice a low, insistent murmur. Where is it? She closed her eyes, her mind reeling. She couldn't give him the journal. It was the only leverage she had, the only proof of Lorenzo's betrayal, the only thing that could potentially protect her. But what could she do? She was trapped, surrounded, betrayed. She had no allies, no weapons, no escape. A sudden, desperate idea sparked in her mind. A risky gamble, a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a newfound determination. "I'll tell you where it is," she said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "But first, you have to tell me something." His eyebrows rose, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "And what is that?" "Tell me." Her voice was hard, and he was momentarily taken aback by the steel he heard. "Why Lorenzo wrote my name in that book. Tell me the truth, Tommaso. For once in your life, tell me the truth." The air in the palazzo hung heavy with the question, the unasked questions that followed. Why was her name in the ledger? What were the implications? What was the plan? And Tommaso hesitated, his lips tightening almost imperceptibly. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Benedetti. Tommaso's hesitation was a crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability that Aurora seized upon. It was a small victory, but in her desperate situation, it was all she had. He stepped back slightly, creating a sliver of space between them, a buffer against the intensity of her gaze and the weight of her question. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, a gesture of agitation that belied his usual composure. "The truth?" he said, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness, a trace of something that might have been regret. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Aurora, especially in our world. I've lived with lies my entire life." "Tommaso," Aurora countered, her voice unwavering. "I deserve the truth. At least now." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her motives, to assess the depth of her resolve. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint, distant sounds of the city beyond the palazzo walls. Finally, he sighed, a heavy, resigned sound that seemed to carry the weight of years, of secrets, of unspoken burdens. "Lorenzo was a complicated man," he began, choosing his words carefully. "He had ambitions, desires, that went beyond the traditional boundaries of our families." Aurora knew this, of course. She'd seen glimpses of it, hints of a ruthlessness that had always been carefully concealed beneath a veneer of respectability. But she needed to hear it from Tommaso, to hear the confirmation of her suspicions, to understand the full extent of Lorenzo's treachery. He wanted more power. Tommaso continued, his voice low, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Aurora's shoulder. "More control. He saw you as a means to an end." Aurora flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She had always known, on some level, that Lorenzo's affection for her had been conditional, that she had been a prize, a trophy, a symbol of his status. But to hear it spoken aloud, to hear it from Tommaso, was a different kind of pain. "He planned to use you," Tommaso said, his voice hardening, his eyes flashing with a flicker of anger. "To manipulate your family, your connections, to further his own agenda." Aurora's family, the Rossi, were not as powerful as the de Rossi or the Benedetti, but they were respected, influential, with a long history of diplomacy. They were peacemakers, negotiators, a valuable asset in the delicate balance of power that existed between the families. But what was the plan? Aurora pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "What did he write about me in that journal?" Tommaso hesitated again, his gaze shifting back to her, his expression unreadable. "He wrote about a meeting," he said slowly. "A meeting between you and certain individuals. Individuals who were opposed to his plans." Aurora frowned, her mind racing. She had never attended such a meeting. She had never even heard of such a thing.
"But I don't understand," she said.
"I never met with anyone. I wouldn't even know who to meet." Tommaso's lips curved into a thin, cynical smile. "That's the beauty of Lorenzo's plan, Dolcezza," he said. "You didn't have to know. You were just a pawn. A carefully placed piece on the chessboard." He explained, his voice a low, chilling murmur, how Lorenzo had planned to fabricate evidence, to create the illusion that Aurora was betraying him, that she was conspiring with his enemies. He would then use this betrayal as justification for eliminating her. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Aurora felt a cold dread creeping through her veins, a sense of disbelief, of horror, of profound betrayal. Lorenzo, her husband, the man she had shared her life with, had planned to murder her.
But why?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. Why would he do that? Tommaso's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. Because, Aurora, he said, in our world, love is a weakness. And weakness is a liability. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her silver-streaked hair, the lines etched around her eyes, the sadness that seemed to cling to her like a shroud. He saw you as a loose end, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. A potential threat. Someone who could expose his secrets, his lies. Someone who knew too much. Or, perhaps, someone who had stopped loving him. Someone who had seen through his mask, who had recognized the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Someone who, in his twisted logic, had become expendable. The realization brought a fresh wave of grief, a bitter, aching sadness that settled deep in her heart. She had mourned Lorenzo once, but this was a different kind of mourning. A mourning for the illusion of love, for the life she had believed in, for the future that had been stolen from her. And you? She asked, her voice trembling. What was your role in all of this? Tommaso's expression hardened, his eyes turning cold, his jaw tightening. My role, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, was to clean up the mess, to ensure that Lorenzo's plan succeeded. He was the enforcer, the executioner, the shadow of the Benedetti family. The man who carried out the dirty work, the man who ensured that the family's secrets remained buried, the man who protected their interests. And now he was here to do the same thing again. To silence her, to retrieve the journal, to erase any trace of Lorenzo's betrayal. To protect the family. To protect himself. Aurora looked at him, at the man she had once loved, the man who now stood before her as her enemy. And she saw not just the darkness, not just the ruthlessness, but also the pain. The pain of a life lived in the shadows, of choices made, of sacrifices demanded. So, she said to him, voice trembling, what happens now? The implicit threat hung heavy between them, heavier than the thick, antique air of the palazzo. Chapter 4. Flight into the unknown. The question hung in the air, a silent challenge, a desperate plea. Tommaso's gaze, dark and unreadable, held hers captive. He took a step closer, the subtle scent of his cologne, a mixture of leather and something wilder, filling her senses, a reminder of the danger he represented. What happens now, he repeated, his voice a low murmur, depends on you, Aurora. He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Aurora thought he was reaching for a weapon. Her breath caught in her throat, her muscles tensing, ready to flee, even though she knew it was futile. But instead of a gun, he produced a small, velvet pouch. He held it out to her, his fingers brushing against hers as she took it, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A choice, he replied, his eyes searching hers. A chance. She opened the pouch, her fingers fumbling with the drawstring. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft velvet, was a single, antique key. It was ornate, intricately carved, with a small, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the handle, a single, stylized rose. It's a key, she said, stating the obvious, her mind racing, trying to decipher its meaning. To a villa, Tommaso explained. On the outskirts of Siena. It's secluded. Safe. No one will find you there. Aurora stared at him, disbelief warring with a flicker of hope. You're helping me? He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Let's just say I'm complicating things. For everyone.
But why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do this? After everything, he looked away, his gaze shifting to the window, to the vibrant, bustling city beyond. He seemed to be wrestling with something, a conflict raging within him. Lorenzo was a fool, he said finally, his voice tight with a suppressed anger. He underestimated you. He underestimated us. The us hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, a ghost of their past, of the connection that had once bound them together. I don't want your death on my hands, Aurora, he continued, his voice softening slightly. Not like this. Not because of his mistakes. It wasn't exactly a declaration of love, or even of friendship. It was more of a pragmatic decision, a recognition that her death, orchestrated by Lorenzo, would create more problems than it solved. It would draw unwanted attention, spark suspicion, potentially unravel the delicate web of alliances and rivalries that held their world together. But there was something else in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper motive, a flicker of the man she had once known, the man who had defied his family, who had risked everything for her. This villa, Aurora said, her voice gaining strength, her mind slowly grasping the implications of his offer. It belongs to? It belonged to my grandmother, Tommaso replied. It's been empty for years.
No one knows about it, except me.
And now her. He was entrusting her with a secret, a vulnerability, a chink in his armor. There's money, he continued, nodding towards a pouch. Enough to start over, to disappear. It was an escape, a chance to reinvent herself, to shed the identity of La Vedova de Rossi, to become someone new, someone free. But it was also a trap, a gilded cage of a different kind. She would be forever indebted to him, forever reliant on his generosity, forever looking over her shoulder. And the journal? She asked, her gaze unwavering. His lips curved into a thin, almost imperceptible smile.
Keep it, he said.
As insurance. A reminder of his power, of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of her situation. A reminder that he could, at any moment, change his mind. Go, Aurora, he said, his voice turning urgent. Before I regret this. He turned away, his back to her, a gesture of dismissal, of finality. He was giving her a chance, a sliver of hope, but he was also walking away, severing the last thread that connected them. Aurora hesitated, her heart torn between fear and a desperate longing for freedom. She looked at the key in her hand, at the symbol of the rose, a symbol of beauty, of fragility, of hidden thorns. She made her decision. She slipped the key into her pocket, her fingers closing around it tightly. She turned and walked towards the door, her steps slow but determined. She didn't look back. As she stepped out of the palazzo, into the bright sunlight, into the chaotic, vibrant life of the city, she felt a sense of liberation, of exhilaration, mixed with a profound sadness. She was free, but she was also alone. And the shadow of Tommaso Benedetti, the shadow of her past, would follow her wherever she went. She caught a taxi, directing him to a small pensione she knew near the train station. She would need to be careful, discreet. She couldn't risk being seen, being followed. The journey had begun. Chapter 5. A city of masks and secrets. The pensione was unassuming, tucked away on a narrow, winding street in the Altrarno district, far from the grand palazzos and the watchful eyes of her former life. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, to blend into the anonymous throngs of tourists and locals, to shed their pasts and reinvent themselves. Or at least, to try. Aurora paid for a week in advance, using the cash Tommaso had provided. She registered under a false name, Signora Elena Rossi, a common enough name to be unremarkable, a shield against prying eyes. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but clean and quiet, with a window overlooking a small, enclosed courtyard, a haven of green in the heart of the city. She unpacked her meager belongings, a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, the leather-bound journal, now carefully concealed at the bottom of her suitcase. She felt a strange sense of displacement, of unreality, as if she were living in a dream, a play in which she didn't know her lines. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She needed a plan, a strategy. She couldn't simply run and hide. She needed to understand the full extent of Lorenzo's betrayal, the implications of the journal, the identities of the certain individuals Tommaso had mentioned. She needed to know who she could trust, and who she couldn't. The answer, she knew, lay in Siena. In the villa Tommaso had given her, the villa that held secrets of its own. But she couldn't go there yet. Not until she had a better understanding of the situation, not until she had a clearer picture of the players involved. She decided to start with the names in the journal. She recognized some of them, prominent figures in Florentine society, members of other families, business associates of Lorenzo's. But others were unfamiliar, names that whispered of a darker, more dangerous world, a world she had always deliberately avoided. She spent the next few days exploring the city, losing herself in the crowds, observing, listening, gathering information. She visited the libraries, poring over old newspapers, archives, searching for any mention of the names, any hint of their connections, their rivalries, their secrets. She frequented the cafes, the trattorias, the small, neighborhood bars where people gathered to gossip, to share news, to exchange information. She listened to the conversations around her, picking up snippets of rumors, whispers of scandals, hints of hidden alliances and betrayals. Florence, she realized, was a city of masks and secrets. A city where appearances were everything, where truth was a fluid, malleable thing, where danger lurked beneath the surface of beauty and elegance. She learned that the certain individuals mentioned in the journal were members of a clandestine organization, a group of powerful families who were opposed to Lorenzo's growing influence, to his ruthless ambition. They were a coalition of rivals, united by a common enemy, a fragile alliance held together by mutual distrust and a shared desire for power. And Lorenzo, it seemed, had been planning to eliminate them one by one, to consolidate his power, to become the undisputed ruler of their world. Aurora's role in his plan, she now understood, had been to provide the pretext, the justification for his actions. She was to be the scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb, the catalyst for a bloody power grab. The more she learned, the more she realized the depth of Lorenzo's depravity, the extent of his betrayal, and the more she understood the danger she was in. She was a loose end, a witness, a threat to the established order. And there were people, powerful people, who would stop at nothing to silence her. One evening, as she was sitting in a small, dimly lit trattoria, nursing a glass of Chianti, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two men, seated at a nearby table, were discussing the de Rossi family, the recent death of Lorenzo, the disappearance of his widow. "They say she ran," one of the men said, his voice low, conspiratorial. "Took off in the middle of the night. Like a thief." "She knew too much," the other man replied. "She was a liability." "They'll find her," the first man said, with a chilling certainty. "They always do." Aurora felt a cold hand grip her heart. She knew they were talking about her. She knew that they were the Benedetti, or perhaps another family, equally ruthless, equally determined to protect their interests. She finished her wine, paid her bill, and left the trattoria, her steps quick, her heart pounding. She walked quickly through the narrow, winding streets, her senses on high alert, looking over her shoulder, expecting to see a shadow, a familiar face, a sign that she was being followed. She reached the pensione, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She locked the door to her room, her hands trembling. She knew she couldn't stay there any longer. It was too dangerous. She packed her belongings, her movements hurried, frantic. She needed to get to Siena, to the villa, to the safety of its secluded walls. As she was about to leave, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper slipped under the door. She picked it up, her heart pounding. It was a single, handwritten word. Tonight. There was no signature. She stared at the paper in her hands. Who was this from? And what did it portend? Was this a trap? Or a warning? Chapter 6. The Price of Silence. The single word, tonight, pulsed with a menacing ambiguity. Aurora's mind, already on high alert, raced through possibilities. Was it a threat from Tommaso, retracting his offer of sanctuary? A message from the unknown individuals Lorenzo had planned to betray? Or a sliver of hope, a clandestine ally? She crumpled the note in her fist, the paper a fragile symbol of the precariousness of her situation. The anonymity of the message was both terrifying and, strangely, a comfort. If it were a direct threat, wouldn't they have identified themselves? Unless the lack of signature was itself a signature, a way of saying we know who you are, and you know who we are. She looked around the small, Spartan room, her temporary refuge now feeling like a cage. Staying was not an option. Leaving was a gamble. But staying was a guaranteed capture, or worse. She decided to treat the note as a warning, a signal to accelerate her plans. She had intended to wait a few more days, to gather more information, but time, it seemed, was a luxury she no longer possessed. She checked out of the pensione, offering a vague excuse about a family emergency to the sleepy desk clerk. She took a circuitous route to the train station, doubling back on herself several times, checking for any sign of pursuit. She felt eyes on her, imagined shadows lurking in the doorways, but it could have been her imagination, fueled by fear and adrenaline. She bought a ticket to Siena, choosing a late evening train, hoping to blend in with the commuters and tourists returning home. She sat in the crowded waiting room, her suitcase clutched tightly in her lap, her gaze constantly scanning the faces around her, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of menace. The train journey was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. She watched the landscape flash past, the lights of the city giving way to the darkness of the Tuscan countryside. She tried to calm herself, to focus on the task ahead, to prepare herself for whatever awaited her in Siena. As the train pulled into the Siena station, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. It was late. The station was almost deserted, the silence broken only by the hiss of the brakes and the distant rumble of the city. She stepped off the train, her legs stiff, her senses on high alert. She walked quickly through the station, avoiding eye contact, trying to appear inconspicuous. She found a taxi outside the station, a battered Fiat driven by an elderly man with a weary, seen-it-all expression. She gave him the address Tommaso had provided, a vague description of a villa on the outskirts of the city. The taxi ride was long and winding, the road climbing steadily into the hills, leaving the lights of Siena behind. The landscape became increasingly rural, vineyards and olive groves replacing the buildings and streets. The air was cooler, fresher, scented with the fragrance of pine and earth. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the taxi pulled up to a pair of wrought iron gates, partially hidden by overgrown vines and a crumbling stone wall. The villa, or what she could see of it in the darkness, was a shadowy silhouette against the night sky, a two-story structure with a tiled roof and shuttered windows. Aurora paid the taxi driver, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood for a moment, gazing at the villa, a sense of unease settling over her. It was isolated, secluded, just as Tommaso had described. But it also felt desolate, abandoned. She pushed open the gates, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. She walked up the long, overgrown driveway, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. She reached the front door, a massive, oak affair, studded with iron nails. She took out the key Tommaso had given her, her fingers trembling slightly. She inserted the key into the lock, the mechanism turning with a loud click. She pushed open the door, her heart in her throat. The interior was dark, silent, filled with the musty scent of dust and decay. She stepped inside, her senses on high alert, her hand reaching for the light switch. As the lights flickered on, illuminating the entrance hall, she gasped. The villa was not abandoned. It was ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, their contents scattered across the floor. Paintings were ripped from the walls, tapestries were torn, carpets were stained. It looked as if a violent struggle had taken place, a desperate search for something or someone. And then she saw it. A small, dark stain on the floor, near the foot of the grand staircase. A stain that looked suspiciously like blood. A wave of fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. She was not safe. She had walked into a trap. But whose trap? And where were they now? A floorboard creaked upstairs. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Lost Love. The creak echoed through the silent villa, a sharp, distinct sound that shattered the stillness. Aurora froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her gaze shot upwards, towards the grand staircase that spiraled into the darkness above. She strained her ears, listening for any further sound, any indication of who or what was upstairs. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the frantic beat of her own heart. She considered her options. She could run, flee back into the night, back to the uncertain safety of the city. But where would she go? She was a fugitive, hunted, with nowhere to turn. Or she could stay, confront whatever was waiting for her upstairs. It was a risky gamble, a potentially fatal decision. But she had come this far. She had faced down Tommaso Benedetti, uncovered Lorenzo's betrayal, escaped from Florence. She wouldn't be defeated now. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had to be brave, resourceful, to use her wits to survive. She was no longer the sheltered, compliant wife, the grieving widow. She was a survivor. She picked up a heavy, bronze candlestick from a nearby table, her fingers gripping it tightly. It was a makeshift weapon, but it was better than nothing. She began to ascend the staircase, her steps slow and deliberate, each creak of the wooden treads a potential alarm. The staircase was dimly lit by the faint glow from the entrance hall, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a reminder of the villa's long abandonment, of the violence that had recently transpired. As she reached the top of the stairs, she paused, listening again. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind outside. She could see a long hallway stretching before her, lined with closed doors, each one a potential hiding place, a potential threat. She moved slowly down the hallway, her senses on high alert, the candlestick held aloft, ready to strike. She approached the first door, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and gently pushed it open. The room was empty. A bedroom, once lavishly furnished, now stripped bare, its contents strewn across the floor. She continued down the hallway, checking each room one by one. Each one was the same. Empty. Ransacked. Finally, she reached the last door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. She hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that this was where she would find her answer. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The room was a study, or what had once been a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents scattered across the floor, books ripped apart, their pages torn and crumpled. A large, antique desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in dust and debris. And in the corner, slumped against the wall, was a figure. Aurora approached cautiously, her heart pounding, the candlestick held high. As she drew closer, she could see that it was a man. An elderly man, his face pale, his clothes disheveled, his eyes closed. She lowered the candlestick, her hand trembling. She knelt beside him, her senses on high alert, ready for any sign of danger. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there. Faint, but present. He was alive. She let out a sigh of relief, a wave of tension leaving her body. But her relief was short-lived. As she looked more closely at the man, she realized that he was injured. There was a dark stain on his shirt, near his shoulder, a stain that looked suspiciously like blood. The same blood she had seen downstairs. She gently examined the wound, her fingers probing the area around it. It was a gunshot wound, a clean entry and exit. He had been shot recently. She needed to help him. She needed to stop the bleeding, to clean the wound, to get him medical attention. But she was in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no supplies, no way to call for help. She looked around the room, her eyes searching for anything she could use. She found a torn sheet, ripped from one of the books, and used it to apply pressure to the wound. She found a bottle of brandy on the desk, its contents partially spilled, and used it to clean the area around the wound. As she worked, the man began to stir. He moaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze confused, disoriented.
Who are you?
He asked, his voice weak, raspy. I'm a friend, Aurora replied, her voice soothing, reassuring. I'm here to help you. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to remember something, to place her face. And then, a flicker of recognition sparked in his eyes. Aurora? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Aurora Darasi? Aurora's heart stopped. He knew her. He knew her name. Yes, she replied, her voice trembling.
I'm Aurora.
A faint smile touched his lips.
I knew you'd come, he said.
He told me you would.
He?
Aurora asked, her mind racing.
Who told you?
The man's eyes closed again, his breathing becoming shallow, his body weakening. Tommaso, he whispered. Tommaso Benedetti. And as she looked at his aged features, she saw a ghost of the past appear. A face she knew, a face she hadn't seen in decades, and it was then that she realized who he was and why Tommaso had brought her to this villa. This was Leonardo, Tommaso's uncle. The one who had disappeared all those decades ago, after the feud had erupted. The one everyone said Tommaso's father had killed. Chapter 8. The Serpent's Embrace. The revelation hit Aurora with the force of a physical blow. Leonardo Benedetti, the lost uncle, the presumed dead victim of the family feud, the man whose disappearance had fueled decades of hatred and mistrust between the Darasi and Benedetti clans.
Alive.
And shot. Her mind reeled, trying to process the implications. Tommaso had known. He had known all along that his uncle was alive, that he was hiding in this villa. He had sent her here, not just to escape, but to what? To confront Leonardo? To protect him? To use him as a pawn in some larger game? She looked at Leonardo, his face pale, his breathing shallow, his life ebbing away. She felt a surge of compassion for him, a sense of shared victimhood. They were both pawns, manipulated by the men in their lives, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they hadn't chosen. Leonardo, she said, her voice urgent, her hand pressing against his wound, trying to stem the flow of blood.
Who shot you?
Who did this? He struggled to speak, his words coming in ragged gasps. They found me, he whispered. Lorenzo's men. Lorenzo's men. Even in death, Lorenzo's reach extended, his poison still infecting their lives. But how had they found Leonardo? After all these years, after all this time, unless Tommaso had led them here. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Had Tommaso used her, manipulated her, sent her to this villa as bait, to draw out Lorenzo's men, to finish the job his father had supposedly started decades ago? Was this his twisted way of ending the feud, of eliminating the last remaining witness to his family's crimes? Or was there another explanation? A more complex, more nuanced reason for his actions?
She didn't know.
She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone. I need to get you to a hospital, she said, her voice desperate. I need to get you help. He shook his head weakly. No hospitals, he whispered. They'll find me. He was right. If Lorenzo's men were still looking for him, a hospital would be the first place they'd check. He would be a sitting duck, an easy target. She was trapped. She couldn't leave him, couldn't abandon him to die. But she couldn't stay here either. They were both in danger. She looked around the room, her eyes searching for a solution and escape. She saw a hidden door, concealed behind a bookshelf, a secret passage, perhaps a way out of the villa. She helped Leonardo to his feet, his body weak, his weight leaning heavily on her. She guided him towards the hidden door, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed on the bookshelf, the mechanism clicking, the door swinging open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. She helped Leonardo inside, her steps slow and deliberate, each creak of the wooden floorboards a potential alarm. The passage was damp, musty, filled with the scent of earth and decay. It sloped downwards, leading into the darkness below. She had no idea where it led, where they were going. But it was their only chance. As they descended, she heard voices, muffled but distinct, coming from the villa above. Lorenzo's men. They were searching for them. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get Leonardo to safety, to protect him, to find out the truth. The passage opened into a large, underground cellar, filled with cobwebs and dust. She saw a faint light, emanating from a small, barred window, high up on the wall. She helped Leonardo to a corner, concealing him behind a stack of old crates. She looked around the cellar, her eyes searching for an exit. She saw a heavy, wooden door, bolted from the outside. She approached the door, her heart pounding. She tried to lift the bolt, but it was rusted, stuck fast. She pushed against the door, her shoulder straining, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. She turned back to Leonardo, her face pale, her eyes filled with despair. We're stuck," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze weak, but resolute. "There's another way," he whispered. "A secret tunnel." He pointed towards a far corner of the cellar, where a pile of rubble lay scattered on the floor.
"Behind stones," he said.
A passage to the vineyard. Aurora rushed to the corner, her hands frantically clearing away the rubble, the stones heavy, her fingers bleeding. She found a small opening, a narrow tunnel, barely large enough to crawl through. It was their only hope. She helped Leonardo to the opening, her heart pounding. She told him to crawl through, to follow the tunnel, to wait for her on the other side. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "You won't leave me?" he asked, his voice filled with a desperate plea. "I won't leave you," she promised, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I'll be right behind you." He nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. He crawled into the tunnel, his body disappearing into the darkness. Aurora waited, her heart pounding, listening for any sign of pursuit. She heard the voices again, closer now, coming from the cellar above. They were almost upon her. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had to be brave, to buy Leonardo time, to distract them, to lead them away from the tunnel. She crawled into the opening, her body squeezing through the narrow passage. As she emerged on the other side, she quickly piled the stones back in place, concealing the entrance. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She was in another part of the cellar, a smaller, more confined space. She saw a ladder, leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. She climbed the ladder, her heart pounding. She pushed open the trapdoor, her senses on high alert. She found herself in a small, enclosed courtyard, surrounded by high walls. She heard the voices again coming from the villa, from the main entrance. They were searching for her, for Leonardo. She knew she had to act quickly. She had to create a diversion, to lead them away from the vineyard, to give Leonardo a chance to escape. She saw a broken window, overlooking the courtyard. She picked up a stone, her hand trembling. She threw the stone through the window, the glass shattering with a loud crash. The voices stopped. She heard footsteps, running towards the courtyard. She had their attention. She slipped out, running for the open gateway that led out and to the sprawling acres of the vineyard, praying she could find Leonardo before they did. The hunt had begun. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past. The vineyard stretched before her, a vast expanse of rolling hills, rows of grapevines stretching as far as the eye could see. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, cast long, eerie shadows, making it difficult to see, to navigate. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of ripe grapes and damp earth. Aurora ran, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had no idea where Leonardo was, where he had gone. She had to find him before they did. She called out his name, her voice a desperate whisper, carried away by the wind. "Leonardo!" Leonardo, where are you? There was no answer. Only the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant barking of a dog. She continued to run, stumbling through the rows of vines, her clothes snagging on the branches, her skin scratched by the thorns. She scanned the landscape, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of his presence. She saw a small, stone shed in the distance, a storage building for tools and equipment. She headed towards it, hoping to find Leonardo there, seeking shelter, hiding from his pursuers. As she approached the shed, she heard a sound. A faint moan, a whimper of pain. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. She reached the shed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pushed open the door, her senses on high alert. Leonardo was there, lying on the ground, his body curled up in a fetal position, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He was clutching his shoulder, his shirt stained with blood. Leonardo! Aurora cried, rushing to his side. What happened? Are you all right? He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, with fear. They shot me again, he whispered, his voice weak, raspy. In the leg. Aurora examined his leg, her fingers probing the area around the wound.
He was right.
Another gunshot wound, this one more serious, more debilitating. He had lost a lot of blood. He was weak, fading fast. I can't walk, he said, his voice barely audible. I can't go on. Aurora felt a surge of despair, of helplessness. She was trapped, alone, with a wounded, dying man, in the middle of nowhere. She had failed, but she couldn't give up. She wouldn't give up. She had to find a way to save him, to save herself. She looked around the shed, her eyes searching for anything she could use. She found some old rags, some rope, a rusty bucket. She used the rags to bandage Leonardo's wounds, to try to stop the bleeding. She used the rope to fashion a makeshift splint for his leg. She knew it wasn't enough. He needed medical attention, urgent care. But she couldn't risk taking him to a hospital, not yet. She had to find another way. She remembered Tommaso's words, his offer of sanctuary, his promise of protection. She had distrusted him, suspected him of treachery. But now, she had no other choice. She had to trust him. She had to find him. Leonardo, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I'm going to get you help. I promise. But I need you to tell me everything. I need you to tell me the truth about what happened. About Lorenzo. About Tommaso. About everything. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decide whether to trust her, whether to reveal his secrets. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Finally, he nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. I will tell you, he whispered. I will tell you everything. He began to speak, his voice weak, his words fragmented, but his story slowly unfolded, piece by piece, revealing a tapestry of betrayal, of violence, of long-held secrets. He told her about his youth, about his close relationship with his nephew, Tommaso, about the rivalry between their families, the feud that had poisoned their lives, about his love for a woman from the Derossi family, a woman he had been forbidden to marry. He told her about Lorenzo's ambition, his ruthlessness, his desire for power, about the plot to eliminate the rival families, to consolidate his control, about the fabricated evidence, the lies, the betrayals. He told her about the night he disappeared, the night he was supposedly killed by Tommaso's father. He had been shot, yes, but not killed. Tommaso had saved him, had hidden him, had protected him all these years. Tommaso had known the truth. He had known that his father was innocent, that Lorenzo was the real culprit. He had been protecting his uncle, waiting for the right moment to expose Lorenzo, to avenge his family's honor. And now, that moment had come. Aurora listened, her mind reeling, her heart aching. She had misjudged Tommaso. She had doubted him, suspected him. But he had been protecting her, too. He had sent her to the villa, not to trap her, but to save her. To save Leonardo. To bring them together. To reveal the truth. As Leonardo finished his story, his voice fading, his body weakening, Aurora felt a sense of clarity, of understanding. She knew what she had to do. She had to protect Leonardo. She had to expose Lorenzo's crimes. She had to help Tommaso. She had to fight. But a shadow fell across the door of the small stone outbuilding, and with it, Aurora's heart leaped into her throat. Chapter 10. A Dance with the Devil. The shadow solidified, resolving into a tall, imposing figure blocking the doorway, the faint moonlight outlining his silhouette. Aurora's hand instinctively went to Leonardo's, her grip tightening protectively. Recognition, sharp and chilling, pierced through her fear. It was Tommaso. He stepped into the shed, his presence filling the small space, his dark eyes scanning the scene, taking in Aurora's defensive posture, Leonardo's weakened state, the makeshift bandages, the lingering scent of blood. "So," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, devoid of any warmth, "the prodigal uncle returns. And the runaway bride finds him." His gaze shifted to Aurora, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of something unreadable anger, disappointment, perhaps even a trace of relief, crossing his face. "I told you to stay hidden, Aurora," he said, his voice laced with a quiet menace. "I told you it was dangerous. And I told you I wanted the truth," Aurora retorted, her voice trembling slightly, but holding her ground. "You knew he was alive, Tommaso. All these years you knew." He gave a curt nod, acknowledging her accusation without apology. He was safer here, away from Lorenzo's reach, away from everything.
Safer?
Aurora scoffed, gesturing to Leonardo's wounded leg. "He's been shot.
Twice.
By Lorenzo's men. How did they find him, Tommaso? Did you lead them here?" His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "Do you think so little of me, Aurora? Do you think I would betray my own uncle? My own blood?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with years of mistrust, with the lingering pain of their shared past. "I don't know what to think, Tommaso," Aurora admitted, her voice softening slightly. "I've been lied to my entire life. By Lorenzo. By everyone." He stepped closer, his gaze softening slightly, a flicker of something that might have been compassion in his eyes. "Not by me, Aurora," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Not entirely." He knelt beside Leonardo, his hand gently examining his wounds. "He needs a doctor," he said, his voice grim.
"He needs care."
"We can't take him to a hospital," Aurora said, repeating Leonardo's warning. "They'll be looking for him. For us." Tommaso nodded, his mind already working, calculating, planning. "There's a place," he said. "A clinic. Private. Discreet. It's a risk, but it's our only option." He looked at Aurora, his eyes searching hers, seeking her trust, her cooperation. "Will you come with me, Aurora? Will you trust me?" It was a question that went beyond the immediate crisis, a question that touched upon the deeper, more complex issues that lay between them. The years of separation, the betrayal, the unspoken feelings that still lingered, like embers beneath the ashes. Aurora hesitated, her heart torn between fear and a desperate longing for connection, for understanding. She looked at Leonardo, his face pale, his eyes pleading. She looked at Tommaso, his face etched with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. She made her decision. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I'll come with you." He nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He helped Leonardo to his feet, supporting his weight, guiding him out of the shed. Aurora followed, her senses on high alert, her hand instinctively reaching for the rusty bucket, her makeshift weapon, just in case. They moved slowly, carefully, through the vineyard, Tommaso leading the way, Aurora bringing up the rear, her gaze constantly scanning the shadows, listening for any sign of pursuit. The journey was fraught with tension, with unspoken anxieties. The silence between them was broken only by Leonardo's labored breathing, by the rustling of the leaves, by the distant sound of the city. As they walked, Tommaso began to explain. He told her about the clinic, about the doctor who ran it, a man who owed him a favor, a man who could be trusted. He told her about his plan, his strategy to expose Lorenzo's crimes, to bring justice to his family, to protect Aurora. He had known all along that Lorenzo's men were still looking for Leonardo. He had anticipated their move, had been tracking their movements. He had sent Aurora to the villa, not as bait, but as a catalyst. He had wanted to draw them out, to confront them, to end the threat once and for all. But he hadn't anticipated that they would find Leonardo so quickly, that they would wound him so severely. He had underestimated their ruthlessness. He had overestimated his own control. "I'm sorry, Aurora," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I put you in danger."
I miskalkulated.
It was a rare admission of vulnerability, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. It was a sign of something. Trust? Respect? Perhaps even affection? Aurora didn't know. She didn't want to analyze it, to dissect it. She just wanted to survive.
To get Leonardo to safety.
To find some semblance of peace. As they reached the edge of the vineyard, Tommaso signaled for them to stop. He pointed towards a small, unmarked car, parked discreetly beneath the trees. "We'll take this," he said. "It's untraceable." He helped Leonardo into the back seat, Aurora settling beside him, her hand holding his, offering comfort, reassurance. Tommaso got behind the wheel, his movements quick, efficient. He started the engine, the car purring to life. He looked at Aurora, his eyes meeting hers in the rear-view mirror. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It's going to be a long night." He put the car in gear, and they sped off, leaving the vineyard behind, heading towards an uncertain future, towards a confrontation that had been brewing for decades. The dance with the devil had begun. They drove, and Aurora felt a strange sense of calm descend. She knew it would be a long night, filled with more dangers and possibly betrayals. But for the first time since finding Lorenzo's journal, she felt a glimmer of hope. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Truth. The drive was tense, silent, punctuated only by Leonardo's occasional moans of pain and the hum of the engine. Tommaso drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the rear-view mirror, alert for any sign of pursuit. Aurora sat in the back, tending to Leonardo, her hand resting on his, offering what little comfort she could. The clinic, when they finally reached it, was not what Aurora had expected. It wasn't a modern, sterile building, but rather an old, unassuming farmhouse, nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by rolling hills and olive groves. It looked more like a family home than a medical facility. A man, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a weary smile, greeted them at the door. This was Dr. Rossi, no relation to Aurora's maiden name, a coincidence that caused a fleeting flicker of surprise across Tommaso's face. He ushered them inside, his movements quick and efficient, his demeanor calm and reassuring. Dr. Rossi examined Leonardo, his fingers probing the wounds, his expression grim. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said, his voice low. "He needs surgery. Immediately." Aurora and Tommaso exchanged a worried glance. They knew the risks involved, the possibility that Leonardo might not survive. But they had no other choice. While Dr. Rossi prepared for the surgery, Tommaso led Aurora to a small, sparsely furnished waiting room. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward, filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared past. "Thank you, Tommaso," Aurora said finally, breaking the silence, her voice sincere.
"For everything."
He gave a curt nod, his gaze avoiding hers. "He's my uncle," he said, his voice gruff. "I had to protect him." "But you also protected me," Aurora said, her voice softer. "You could have left me to fend for myself. You could have let them find me." He looked at her then, his dark eyes searching hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "I couldn't do that, Aurora," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I wouldn't." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, the ghosts of their past, of the love they had once shared, of the betrayal that had separated them. "Why, Tommaso?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling slightly.
"Why did you help me?"
After all these years, after everything, he hesitated, his gaze shifting away, as if struggling to find the words, to articulate the complex emotions that churned within him. Lorenzo, he destroyed everything, he said finally, his voice tight with anger, with regret. He took everything from me. My family, my future, my you. The last word was barely a whisper, a confession of a love that had never truly died, a love that had been buried beneath layers of hatred and resentment. I wanted revenge, he continued, his voice hardening. I wanted to make him pay. But I didn't want you to be a casualty. I didn't want you to suffer because of his sins. He had been playing a dangerous game, a long con, manipulating events, pulling strings, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had used Aurora, yes, but not in the way she had feared. He had used her to expose Lorenzo, to bring him down, to avenge his family's honor, and, perhaps, to reclaim something he had lost. The journal, Aurora said, remembering the catalyst for her flight, for her current predicament. What about the meeting? The individuals? Tommaso explained. The meeting had been a fabrication, a lie concocted by Lorenzo to frame Aurora, to justify his actions. But the individuals were real. They were members of a rival coalition, families who had opposed Lorenzo's growing power, who had been targeted for elimination. Tommaso had been working with them, secretly, gathering information, building a case against Lorenzo. He had intended to use the journal to expose Lorenzo's crimes, to bring him down before he could carry out his plans. But Lorenzo's death had changed everything. It had thrown his plans into disarray, had created a power vacuum, had unleashed a new wave of violence and betrayal. They're still out there, Tommaso said, his voice grim. Lorenzo's men. And others. They're looking for the journal. They're looking for you. Aurora felt a chill run down her spine. She was still in danger. They were all in danger. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with a newfound determination, a steely resolve. We fight, he said. We expose them. We finish what Lorenzo started. But before they could formulate a plan, a scream echoed from the operating room. A scream of pain, of terror. Dr. Rossi burst out of the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. He's gone, he said, his voice trembling. Leonardo, he's dead. The words struck Aurora like a blow, and the truth, fully unveiled, laid bare the raw, agonizing reality of their world. Chapter 12. Blood and Betrayal. Leonardo's death was a crushing blow, a devastating loss that sent shockwaves through Aurora and Tommaso. The fragile hope they had clung to, the possibility of justice, of redemption, seemed to shatter with his last breath. Aurora felt a wave of grief wash over her, a profound sadness for the man she had barely known, for the life he had lost, for the secrets he had taken to his grave. She had seen a glimpse of the gentle soul beneath the hardened exterior, a man scarred by the violence and betrayal of his world. Tommaso, however, reacted with a cold, controlled fury. His face was a mask of barely suppressed rage, his eyes burning with a dark intensity. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his body taut with barely contained violence. They will pay for this, he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. Every single one of them. Dr. Rossi, his face etched with a mixture of fear and resignation, tried to reason with him. Tommaso, please, he said. It was a complication. The surgery, there was nothing I could do. Tommaso ignored him, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his mind already plotting, scheming, planning his revenge. He was a man consumed by vengeance, driven by a primal need to settle the score, to avenge his uncle's death. Aurora understood his rage, his pain. She felt it herself, a burning ember deep within her heart. But she also knew that violence begets violence, that revenge was a hollow victory. Tommaso, she said, her voice soft but firm, placing a hand on his arm, trying to reach him, to pull him back from the abyss. We need to think. We need to be smart. We can't just lash out. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a wild, untamed fury. They killed him, Aurora, he said, his voice raw with emotion. They murdered my uncle. They deserve to die. And what then? Aurora countered, her voice rising slightly. More blood? More death? Will that bring Leonardo back? Will that bring us peace? He hesitated, his gaze flickering, a flicker of doubt crossing his face.
He knew she was right.
He knew that violence was not the answer. But his rage, his grief, were too powerful, too overwhelming. We need to find out who did this, Aurora continued, her voice calmer now, more persuasive. We need to find out who ordered the hit. We need to expose them. She remembered the journal, the key to unraveling Lorenzo's web of deceit, the potential weapon to bring down his allies, his conspirators.
The journal, she said.
We need to use it. We need to share it.
With the right people.
Tommaso looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to assess her motives, to gauge her resolve. He saw a strength in her, a determination that he hadn't seen before. He saw a woman who had been transformed by her experiences, a woman who was no longer afraid. Who? He asked, his voice still gruff, but with a hint of curiosity. Who do we trust? Aurora had been thinking about this, weighing her options, considering the possibilities. She knew that she couldn't trust the authorities, not in their world, where corruption ran deep, where alliances shifted like sand. But there was one person, one family, that she believed she could trust. A family with a reputation for integrity, for fairness, for justice. The Moretti family, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. They were rivals of Lorenzo's, yes, but they were also honorable. They have influence. They can help us. The Moretti family were a powerful force in the Florentine underworld, a clan known for their strict code of ethics, their unwavering loyalty, their ruthlessness. They were not to be trifled with, but they were also known for their sense of justice, for their willingness to stand up for what was right. Tommaso considered her suggestion, his mind weighing the risks, the potential benefits. He knew the Moretti family, respected their power, their influence. He also knew that they were not to be trusted lightly, that they had their own agenda, their own ambitions. It's a gamble, he said finally, his voice cautious. A dangerous gamble. It's our only chance, Aurora countered. We need allies. We need protection. He nodded, his lips forming a thin, grim smile. All right, Aurora, he said. We'll play your game. We'll go to the Moretti. But we do it my way. His way, Aurora knew, meant caution, strategy, a willingness to use force if necessary. It meant walking a tightrope, balancing between diplomacy and violence, between trust and suspicion. They left the clinic, leaving Leonardo's body behind, a stark reminder of the price of betrayal, of the cost of their fight. They drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears, their own hopes. As they approached the city, Tommaso pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to Aurora, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of determination and tenderness. Before we do this, he said, his voice low, his gaze intense. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time, by sorrow, by experience. I loved you, Aurora, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I always have. And I always will. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared past, with the uncertainty of their future. Aurora's heart ached. She had loved him, too.
Once.
With a fierce, reckless passion that had defied all logic, all reason. But that love had been poisoned, twisted, destroyed by the machinations of their families, by the weight of tradition, by the inescapable reality of their world. Could they ever reclaim that love? Could they ever overcome the obstacles, the betrayals, the scars of the past? She didn't know. She didn't dare to hope. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a flicker of something that gave her a glimmer of possibility. A spark of hope in the darkness. A chance. But a car suddenly screeched to a halt beside them, boxing them in, and before Aurora could answer, could even breathe, men poured out. Chapter 13. The Lioness Awakens. The sudden ambush shattered the fragile moment of intimacy, plunging them back into the brutal reality of their world. Aurora's heart leaped into her throat, adrenaline surging through her veins. The men surrounding their car were unfamiliar, But their intent was clear. They were not here for friendly chat. They were heavily armed, their faces masked, their movements swift and efficient. They yanked open the car doors, dragging Tommaso and Aurora out onto the rough asphalt.
Who are you?
Tommaso demanded, his voice a low growl, struggling against the grip of the men holding him.
What do you want?
Their only answer was a brutal shove, forcing him to his knees. Aurora, despite her fear, fought back, kicking and scratching, refusing to be subdued. "Leave him alone," she cried, her voice filled with a desperate defiance. "He's done nothing." One of the men backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling to the ground. Her head swam, her vision blurring, but she refused to give in. She crawled back to her feet, her eyes blazing with anger, with a newfound ferocity. She had been a victim for too long, a pawn in the games of powerful men. She had endured betrayal, loss, fear. But she would not be broken. She would not be silenced. She was Aurora Derasi, and she would fight. "You want a journal, don't you?" she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her gaze fixed on the leader of the group, a tall, imposing figure who stood slightly apart, his face obscured by a dark scarf. "You want to silence me. You want to finish what Lorenzo started." The leader gave a curt nod, his eyes glinting coldly in the dim light. "The Signora is perceptive," he said, his voice a raspy whisper, distorted by the scarf. Pity she didn't use that perception earlier. It might have saved her a lot of trouble. "It's not too late," Aurora said, her voice gaining strength, her mind racing, searching for a way out, a solution. "I can give you the journal. I can cooperate. But you have to let Tommaso go. He's not involved." It was a lie, of course. Tommaso was deeply involved. But she had to protect him, to buy him time, to give him a chance to escape. The leader chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You think I'm a fool, Signora?"
he said.
"You think I would believe such a transparent lie?" He gestured to his men, and they tightened their grip on Tommaso, one of them pressing a gun against his head. "We know about your relationship," the leader continued. "We know about your past. You are both liabilities. You both know too much." Aurora felt a cold dread creeping through her veins. They were trapped. There was no way out. But then, she remembered something. Something Tommaso had told her. About the Moretti family. About their code of ethics, their sense of justice, their ruthlessness. She had to take a chance. A desperate, reckless gamble. "You work for the Salviati family, don't you?" she said, her voice loud and clear, her gaze unwavering. "You're doing their dirty work. You're cleaning up their mess." The Salviati family were another powerful clan in the Florentine underworld, known for their brutality, their lack of scruples, their ambition. They were rivals of the Moretti, bitter enemies, constantly vying for power, for control. The leader stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of surprise, of uncertainty, crossing his face. How do you know that?" he asked, his voice losing some of its confidence. "I know more than you think," Aurora replied, her voice gaining strength, her confidence growing. "I know about their plans. I know about their alliances. I know about their weaknesses." She was bluffing, of course. She knew very little about the Salviati family, but she had to make them believe her, to make them doubt, to make them hesitate. "And I also know," she continued, her voice rising in intensity, "that the Moretti family will not be pleased. They will not tolerate this interference. They will not allow you to eliminate their potential allies." She was playing on their fears, on their rivalries, on the delicate balance of power that existed between the families. She was using their own rules, their own codes against them. The leader hesitated, his gaze shifting to his men, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks, assessing the potential consequences. He knew that Aurora was right. The Moretti family were not to be trifled with. They would retaliate, swiftly and brutally, if they felt their interests were threatened. He had a choice to make. He could kill them, silence them, and risk the wrath of the Moretti. Or he could let them go. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of their breathing, by the distant hum of the city. Finally, the leader made his decision. "Let them go," he said, his voice grudging, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "But tell them this is not over. We will find them. We will finish this." His men released Tommaso and Aurora, shoving them back towards their car. They climbed back into their own vehicles, their engines roaring to life. They sped off, disappearing into the night, leaving Tommaso and Aurora alone, shaken but alive. Aurora collapsed against the car, her legs weak, her body trembling. She had done it. She had saved them.
For now.
Tommaso knelt beside her, his hand gently touching her face, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You were amazing, Aurora," he said, his voice soft, his gaze intense. You saved us. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. "The lioness awakens," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. He helped her into the car, his touch gentle, his movements protective. He got behind the wheel, his face grim, his eyes filled with a renewed determination. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised. They were no longer just running, hiding. They were fighting back. And the Moretti were their only hope. He started the car and sped off, knowing they couldn't go to the clinic. It was too dangerous. Chapter 14. Ghosts of Regret. The near-death encounter had shaken them both, leaving them raw and vulnerable. The adrenaline that had fueled Aurora's defiance slowly dissipated, replaced by a profound exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that settled into her very core. Tommaso drove in silence, his face a mask of grim determination, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew they needed a safe haven, a place to regroup, to plan their next move. The clinic was out of the question, compromised by the attack. Their homes, their usual haunts, were undoubtedly under surveillance. He decided to head towards his family's old villa, a sprawling estate nestled in the hills overlooking Florence. It was a risky move, a place steeped in history, in memories, both good and bad. But it was also secluded, fortified, and, he hoped, overlooked by their enemies. As they drove, the silence between them became heavy, laden with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared past, with the uncertainty of their future. Aurora leaned her head against the window, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, the city lights twinkling in the distance, a reminder of the life she had once known, the life that had been shattered by betrayal and violence. "I keep thinking about Leonardo," she said finally, her voice soft, breaking the silence. "He didn't deserve to die like that. He deserved peace." Tommaso nodded, his jaw tightening, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and guilt. "He was a good man," he said, his voice gruff. "He was caught in the middle. Like us." "He told me about her," Aurora continued, her voice hesitant, her gaze shifting to Tommaso. "The woman he loved. The woman from my family." Tommaso's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning even whiter. He knew who she was talking about. It was a story he had heard many times, a family legend, a tale of forbidden love, of tragedy, of regret. "Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the name a ghost from the past. Aurora nodded. He said they were going to run away together. To elope. To escape the feud. It was a story that mirrored their own, a reflection of the love they had once shared, the love that had been thwarted by the hatred and violence of their families. "My father," he stopped them, Tommaso said, his voice filled with a bitter resentment. He threatened her. He threatened Leonardo. He forced them to separate. It was a story Aurora had never heard, a detail that had been carefully concealed, a secret that had been buried beneath layers of lies and half-truths. He told Leonardo that he would kill her, Tommaso continued, his voice raw with emotion. That he would destroy her family. He gave him no choice. Leonardo had chosen to sacrifice his own happiness, his own love, to protect Isabella, to save her from his father's wrath. He had disappeared, had lived in hiding, had endured years of loneliness and isolation, all for the sake of the woman he loved. And Isabella? She had married another man, a man chosen for her by her family, a man she had never loved. She had lived a life of quiet desperation, of unspoken regret, of enduring sorrow. It was a tragic tale, a testament to the destructive power of hatred, of the devastating consequences of family feuds, of the enduring pain of lost love. He never stopped loving her, Aurora said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. He told me. He said she was the love of his life. Tommaso nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And she never stopped loving him, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I saw it in her eyes. When she came to the villa. To see him. Isabella. The housekeeper. The woman who had betrayed Aurora. Who had worked with Tommaso. It all made sense now. Her fear. Her complicity. Her understanding. She had been protecting Leonardo all these years. She had been helping Tommaso, secretly, to keep him safe, to keep his memory alive. She had been motivated by love, by loyalty, by regret. The realization hit Aurora with the force of a physical blow. She had judged Isabella harshly, had condemned her as a traitor. But she had been wrong. Isabella had been a victim, too, a pawn in the games of powerful men, a woman caught in the crossfire of a conflict she hadn't chosen. We need to tell her, Aurora said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. We need to let her know that he's gone. Tommaso nodded, his face etched with a mixture of grief and determination. Yes, he said. We will. They continued to drive, the silence between them now filled with a shared sense of loss, of understanding, of connection. The ghosts of the past had been awakened, their stories intertwined, their destinies linked. They soon arrived at the large, darkened villa. It looked deserted, haunted, filled with untold secrets. Chapter 15. A promise forged in fire. The Benedetti villa stood silent and imposing, a sentinel perched on the hillside, its darkened windows like watchful eyes staring out over the sprawling city below. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile confines of the clinic, the chaotic energy of the vineyard. Tommaso parked the car discreetly behind a cluster of ancient cypress trees, their gnarled branches casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. He turned off the engine, plunging them into a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the city. We need to be careful, he said, his voice low, his hand resting on the door handle. The place might be watched. We don't know who we can trust. Aurora nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation, a sense of returning to a place that held both painful memories and a flicker of belonging. They exited the car, their movements slow and cautious, their senses on high alert. Tommaso led the way, his body tense, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. He produced a key, an old, ornate piece of metal, and unlocked a side entrance, a small, unassuming door hidden beneath a thick layer of ivy. They slipped inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click, sealing them within the shadowed depths of the villa. The interior was dark, musty, filled with the scent of aged wood and dust. Tommaso found a light switch, illuminating a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow them as they moved. This way, he said, his voice a hushed whisper, guiding Aurora through the labyrinthine corridors, past grand, empty rooms, their furniture shrouded in white sheets, like ghosts of a bygone era. He led her to a small, secluded study, a room tucked away at the back of the villa, overlooking a walled garden. It was a room filled with books, with maps, with the accumulated knowledge of generations of Benedetti. It was also a room that held personal significance for Tommaso, a place where he had spent countless hours as a child, listening to stories of his family's history, learning the intricacies of their world. He lit a fire in the hearth, the flames flickering to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, chasing away the chill that had settled into their bones. He gestured towards a pair of worn leather armchairs, inviting Aurora to sit. We're safe here, he said, his voice reassuring, his gaze softening slightly.
For now.
Aurora sank into one of the chairs, her body exhausted, her mind racing. She looked around the room, taking in the details, the worn leather-bound books, the antique globe, the faded tapestries. It was a room steeped in history, in tradition, in secrets. This place, she said, her voice hesitant, her gaze shifting to Tommaso. It feels haunted. He nodded, his lips forming a faint, sad smile.
It is, he said.
By the ghosts of our past. By the regrets of our families. He sat down in the opposite chair, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, his mind lost in thought. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, intimate, a shared understanding that transcended words. We need to contact the Moretti, Aurora said finally, breaking the silence, her voice determined. We need to tell them everything. We need their help. Tommaso nodded, his agreement a silent acknowledgement of the precariousness of their situation. He knew that reaching out to the Moretti was a risky gamble, a potential alliance that could either save them or destroy them. I have a way, he said, his voice low, his gaze shifting to a locked drawer in the antique desk. A secure line. A number known only to a few. He retrieved a small, encrypted phone from the drawer, its screen blank, its buttons unmarked. It was a device designed for secrecy, for untraceable communication, a tool of their clandestine world. He dialed a series of numbers, his movements swift and precise, his face a mask of concentration. He waited, his ear pressed to the phone, listening for a response. Finally, a voice answered, a gruff, guarded tone, speaking in a coded language that Aurora couldn't understand. Tommaso responded in kind, his words clipped, his tone urgent. The conversation was brief, cryptic, ending with a promise of a meeting, a rendezvous at an undisclosed location, at a specified time. Tommaso hung up the phone, his face etched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They've agreed to meet, he said, his voice low. But they're cautious. They're suspicious. They have every right to be, Aurora said, her voice understanding. We're asking them to trust us, to believe us, when we have nothing to offer them, except the truth. The truth. It was a fragile, dangerous weapon, a double-edged sword that could either liberate them or condemn them. We need to prepare, Tommaso said, his voice regaining its firmness, its determination. We need to anticipate their questions. We need to convince them. They spent the next few hours reviewing the contents of the journal, dissecting Lorenzo's plans, identifying the key players, outlining the evidence. They rehearsed their story, their arguments, their plea. As the night wore on, a sense of shared purpose, of mutual resolve, began to grow between them. They were no longer just two individuals, bound by a shared past, by a tangled web of love and betrayal. They were allies, partners, united in their fight for justice, for survival. Tommaso looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something more. He saw a strength in her, a resilience that he had never seen before. He saw a woman who had been transformed by her experiences, a woman who was no longer afraid. You've changed, Aurora, he said, his voice soft, his gaze intense. You're stronger. You're braver. Aurora met his gaze, her eyes filled with a newfound confidence, a quiet determination. I had to, she said, her voice firm. I had no choice. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers, his fingers intertwining with hers. We'll face this together, Aurora, he said, his voice a promise forged in fire. We'll survive this. Together. And in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, by the weight of their shared history, they made a pact. A promise. To fight. To survive. To find their way back to each other. Or to go down, together, in flames. The phone rang, shattering the quiet. Tommaso answered. Chapter 16. The Heart's Reckoning. The ringing phone sliced through the quiet intimacy, a jarring intrusion from the outside world. Tommaso snatched it up, his expression instantly shifting from tenderness to guarded alertness. He listened intently, his face a mask of concentration, offering only curt, monosyllabic responses. Aurora watched him, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She knew the call was from the Moretti family, the signal that the dangerous game they were playing was about to escalate. He hung up, his face grim, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "They're waiting." "Here?" Aurora asked, her voice rising slightly in surprise. "At the villa?" He nodded. "They insisted. They want to assess the situation. They want to see us. On their terms." It was a power play, a demonstration of their control, a reminder that they were the ones holding the cards. Tommaso and Aurora were supplicants, seeking their aid, their protection. "We have no choice," Tommaso said, his voice resigned. "We have to meet them. We have to convince them." He led Aurora through the villa, towards the grand salon, a vast, opulent room filled with antique furniture, with priceless paintings, with the accumulated wealth and power of generations of Benedetti. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light emanating from a large fireplace, where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the flames, their faces obscured, their bodies radiating an aura of authority, of menace. As Tommaso and Aurora approached, the figures turned, their faces coming into view. The leader of the group was a woman, middle-aged, with striking features, with piercing gray eyes, with a presence that commanded respect, even fear. This was Donatella Moretti, the matriarch of the Moretti family, a woman known for her intelligence, her ruthlessness, her unwavering loyalty to her clan. Beside her stood 2 men, younger, their bodies taut with barely contained energy, their hands resting on the weapons concealed beneath their tailored suits. They were her sons, her enforcers, her protectors. "Signor Benedetti," Donatella said, her voice smooth, cultured, but with an underlying edge of steel.
"Signora De Rossi, we meet at last."
Tommaso inclined his head, a gesture of respect, but not subservience. "Donatella," he said, his voice equally controlled. "We appreciate you seeing us." "We are intrigued," Donatella replied, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing, judging. "By your request. By your claims." "We have proof," Aurora said, stepping forward, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "We have evidence of Lorenzo de Rossi's crimes, of the conspiracy, of the threat to your family." Donatella raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "Evidence?"
she said.
"Show us." Aurora retrieved the leather-bound journal from her bag, the weight of it feeling heavier than ever, the responsibility it represented a burden she was now willing to share. She handed it to Donatella, her hand trembling slightly. Donatella took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather, her eyes scanning the pages, her expression unreadable. She read for a long moment, the silence in the room broken only by the crackling fire, by the faint sound of their breathing. Finally, she looked up, her gaze piercing, her eyes filled with a cold calculation. "This changes things," she said, her voice low. "This implicates many, including some we considered allies." The journal, Aurora knew, was a Pandora's box of secrets and lies. It was the revelation of those that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power, to ignite a war between the families, to unleash a wave of violence and bloodshed. "We need your help," Tommaso said, his voice urgent. "We need your protection. We need your influence. To expose them. To bring them to justice." Donatella considered his request, her mind weighing the risks, the potential benefits. She knew that aligning herself with Tommaso and Aurora was a dangerous game, a gamble that could cost her dearly. But she also saw an opportunity to weaken her rivals, to consolidate her power, to expand her influence. "What do you offer in return?" she asked, her voice sharp, her gaze unwavering. Tommaso hesitated, his mind racing. He had nothing to offer, nothing of tangible value. "Except himself. My loyalty," he said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting hers. "My service. My life." It was a bold offer, a dangerous promise. It was a commitment to a new alliance, a new allegiance, a new family. Donatella studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, assessing his sincerity, his determination. She saw a man scarred by the past, driven by vengeance, but also honorable. A man who was willing to risk everything, to sacrifice everything, for what he believed in. She saw a potential asset, a valuable ally. "Very well," she said finally, her lips forming a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "We accept your offer. We will help you. We will protect you. But you will follow our lead. You will obey our commands. You will be ours." The agreement was sealed, the pact forged. A new alliance had been formed. A new game had begun. Aurora felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of safety, of hope. But she also knew that they had just entered a new, more dangerous world. A world where loyalty was a currency, where betrayal was a constant threat, where survival was never guaranteed. Her heart, however, couldn't help but also feel a sense of dread. She knew, somehow, that this was only the beginning. Donatello looked between the two, and a cruel smile twisted her lips. "But first," she began, "there is the matter of cleaning house, Sasai." Chapter 17. Crossroads of Destiny. Donatella's words, laced with a chilling implication, hung in the air. Cleaning house was a euphemism, a thinly veiled threat that spoke of eliminating loose ends, of silencing potential threats, of purging their ranks of any suspected traitors. Aurora's heart sank. She knew what Donatello was suggesting, who she was targeting. Isabella, the housekeeper, the woman who had betrayed Aurora, but who had also, unknowingly, been a victim, a woman driven by a long-lost love, by a desperate desire to protect the man she had never stopped caring for. "No," Aurora said, stepping forward, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "Isabella is not a threat. She was protecting Leonardo. She was misled." Donatello raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Sentimentality, Signora de Rossi?" she said, her voice laced with a hint of mockery. "A dangerous weakness in our world." "She knows nothing," Aurora insisted. "She's innocent." "She knows us," Donatello countered. "She knows about this meeting. She's a liability." Tommaso remained silent, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew Donatello was right from a purely pragmatic perspective. Isabella was a risk, a potential leak of information. But he also felt a pang of guilt, a sense of responsibility for the woman who had helped him, who had protected his uncle, who had loved him in her own way. "There has to be another way," Aurora pleaded, her voice desperate. "We can protect her. We can make sure she doesn't talk." Donatella considered her suggestion, her mind weighing the options, calculating the risks. She saw the desperation in Aurora's eyes, the genuine concern for the woman's safety. She also saw a potential weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. "Perhaps," she said finally, her lips forming a thin, cruel smile. "Perhaps there is another way, but it will come at a price." Aurora's heart sank. She knew what Donatello was implying. She was demanding a sacrifice, a demonstration of loyalty, a test. "What price?" Tommaso asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on Donatella. Donatella's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with a cold calculation. "You," she said. "You will be the one to handle it. You will ensure her silence."
Permanently.
Tommaso flinched, his face paling slightly. He had expected a demand, a sacrifice, but not this. Not Isabella. He looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and resolve. He knew what he had to do. He had made a pact, a promise. He had pledged his loyalty, his service, his life. "No," Aurora said again, her voice rising in protest. "You can't ask him to do that. He can't." Donatella ignored her, her gaze fixed on Tommaso. "Do we have an agreement, Signor Benedetti?" she asked, her voice sharp, demanding. Tommaso hesitated, his mind battling with his conscience, with his emotions, with his sense of honor. He looked at Aurora, her eyes pleading, her face filled with a desperate hope. He made his decision. "There is another," he said, his voice surprisingly clear, despite the obvious internal turmoil. "Another what?" asked Donatella, annoyed. Another threat, Tommaso answered. Salviati's men. They know about Aurora. They know about the journal. They're still out there. Donatella's eyes narrowed. And, Tommaso said, stepping closer to her, the movement so natural that her guards didn't react. They will come for her. They will come for the journal. And if they are not dealt with, his voice lowered, conspiratorially, they will jeopardize this entire operation. Aurora watched, bewildered. What was Tommaso doing? I will deal with Salviati's men, Tommaso said. I will eliminate them. Permanently. He paused. But I will need resources. Information. Your help. Donatella studied him, a flicker of something that might have been respect in her eyes. He had turned the tables, subtly but effectively. He had offered her a greater prize, a more significant victory. He had impressed her. Very well, Signor Benedetti, she said, her lips forming a faint smile. You have a deal. We will provide you with what you need. But do not fail us. The consequences would be severe. Tommaso nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. I understand, he said. The meeting ended, the agreement sealed. Tommaso and Aurora were now pawns in Donatella's game, players in a dangerous dance of power and betrayal. But Tommaso had bought them time, had shifted the focus, had saved Isabella. For now. As they left the villa, Aurora turned to Tommaso, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. What was that all about? She asked, her voice hushed. You tricked her. He gave a slight shrug, a faint smile playing on his lips. I offered her a bigger fish to fry, he said. I appealed to her ambition. But Salviati's men, they're a threat, he said. A real threat. And I will deal with them. But not alone. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound intensity, a determination that sent a shiver down her spine. We're in this together, Aurora, he said, his voice firm. We'll face them. We'll face everyone. Together. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers, his fingers intertwining with hers. Their destinies were intertwined, their paths converging at a crossroads of danger and opportunity. They had made their choices, forged their alliances, and now they would face the consequences, together. But as they stepped out of the villa, Aurora felt a sharp pain in her back. She gasped. Chapter 18. The Weight of Loyalty. The sharp, searing pain in Aurora's back stole her breath, her legs buckling beneath her. She gasped, her hand flying to the source of the agony, her fingers encountering a warm, sticky wetness. Aurora! Tommaso cried, catching her as she stumbled, his arms wrapping around her protectively. He lowered her gently to the ground, his face etched with a mixture of shock and fear. He saw the blood staining her dress, spreading rapidly, a crimson blossom blooming on the delicate fabric. He saw the small, silver blade protruding from her back, the handle glinting cruelly in the moonlight. A knife. She had been stabbed. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the surroundings, searching for the attacker, for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. But there was nothing. Only the silent villa, the whispering trees, the indifferent stars. It had been a silent attack, swift and deadly, a professional hit. Someone had been waiting for them, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. But who? Salviati's men? A rival family? Or someone within Donatella's ranks, someone who hadn't been convinced by Tommaso's deception, someone who had decided to eliminate the liability themselves? He didn't know. He couldn't be sure. But he knew one thing. Aurora was in danger. She was losing blood rapidly. She needed help. Immediately. He ripped a strip of fabric from his shirt, pressing it against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. Aurora, stay with me, he said, his voice urgent, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. Stay awake. Don't close your eyes. Aurora moaned, her face pale, her eyes fluttering. She tried to speak, but the words came out as a choked whisper. Tommaso, I can't. You can, he insisted, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. You have to. You're strong, Aurora. You're a fighter. You have to survive. He knew he couldn't take her to a hospital, not now. It was too risky. They were being hunted, targeted. They needed to get her to safety, to a place where they could treat her wounds, where they could protect her. He thought of the clinic of Dr. Rossi, but it was too far, too dangerous to reach. He needed someplace closer, someplace secure. He remembered the old hunting lodge, a small, secluded cabin nestled deep within the woods, a place he had used as a refuge, a hideout in his youth. It was remote, off the beaten path, known only to a few. It was their only chance. He lifted Aurora into his arms, her body limp, her weight surprisingly light. He carried her towards the car, his steps swift and determined, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed her gently in the back seat, propping her up with cushions, trying to make her as comfortable as possible. He got behind the wheel, his hands trembling, his mind racing. He started the engine, the car roaring to life. He drove, fast and recklessly, navigating the winding roads, pushing the vehicle to its limits. He had to get her to safety, to save her life. The journey was a blur of anxiety and fear, of desperate prayers and unspoken pleas. He kept talking to her, urging her to stay awake, to fight, to survive. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the hunting lodge. It was a small, rustic cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, nestled among towering pine trees, hidden from the world. He carried Aurora inside, laying her gently on a worn, leather couch. He lit a fire in the hearth, the flames flickering to life, casting a warm glow on the room. He gathered supplies, whatever he could find: bandages, antiseptic, a bottle of brandy, a sewing kit. He was no doctor, but he had some basic knowledge of first aid, enough to stabilize her. He worked quickly, efficiently, his hands trembling, his heart pounding. He cleaned the wound, removing the knife with a swift, decisive movement, causing Aurora to cry out in pain. He disinfected the area, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. He stitched the wound, his needlework clumsy but effective. He bandaged her back, wrapping the fabric tightly around her torso. He covered her with a blanket, trying to keep her warm, to prevent shock. He sat beside her, his hand holding hers, his gaze fixed on her face, watching for any sign of improvement, any flicker of consciousness. The hours passed slowly, agonizingly. The fire burned low, the shadows deepened, the silence of the night pressed in on them. Aurora remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, her pulse weak. Tommaso felt a wave of despair wash over him, a sense of helplessness, of hopelessness. He had failed her. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe. But he had failed. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. He had lost so much, endured so much pain, so much betrayal. He couldn't lose her, too. He wouldn't. He looked up, his eyes filled with a renewed determination, a fierce resolve. He would not give up. He would not let her die. He would fight. For her. For their future. For their love. He leaned down, his lips gently brushing her forehead, whispering a silent prayer, a desperate plea. "Please, Aurora," he murmured.
Please come back to me.
And as dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Aurora's eyes fluttered open. Chapter 19. Shattered Illusions. Aurora's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with pain and confusion. The first thing she saw was Tommaso's face, etched with worry and relief, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. "Tommaso?" she whispered, her voice raspy, her throat dry. "Shoo," he soothed, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Don't try to talk. You're safe now. You're with me." She tried to sit up, but a sharp, searing pain shot through her back, forcing her to lie back down. She gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for the source of the agony. "Don't move," Tommaso said, his voice urgent. "You've been injured. You need to rest." She remembered then. The villa. The meeting with Donatella. The knife.
The blood.
The betrayal. "Who?" she asked, her voice weak, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of what had happened.
Who did this?
Tommaso hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He knew the truth, or at least he suspected it. But he couldn't bring himself to say it, to shatter the fragile illusion of safety, of trust. "We don't know," he lied, his voice strained. "It could have been anyone. Salviati's men. A rival family. We have many enemies." Aurora looked at him, her eyes searching his, seeing through his deception, recognizing the unspoken truth that lay beneath his words. "It was Donatello, wasn't it?" she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a chilling certainty. Tommaso flinched, his face paling slightly. He couldn't deny it, not anymore. He had tried to protect her, to shield her from the harsh reality of their world. But he had failed. She didn't trust us," he admitted, his voice filled with a bitter resignation. She saw you as a liability, a loose end." Aurora felt a cold wave of despair wash over her, a sense of profound betrayal. She had trusted Donatella, had believed in her promise of protection, of justice. But it had all been a lie, a charade, a manipulation. They were all pawns in her game, expendable pieces on her chessboard. "And you," she said, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on Tommaso. "You knew. You let her." He shook his head, his eyes filled with anguish. "No, Aurora," he said, his voice desperate. "I tried to stop her. I bargained with her. I offered her something else." He explained about his deception, about his plan to target Salviati's men, about his attempt to save Isabella, to save them all. But it hadn't been enough. Donatella had been one step ahead, had anticipated his move, had outmaneuvered him. She played us," Aurora said, her voice filled with a bitter realization. "She used us. She never intended to help us." Tommaso nodded, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and self-loathing. He had been so focused on his own plans, on his own desire for revenge, that he had failed to see the bigger picture, the true extent of Donatella's treachery. He had underestimated her. He had overestimated his own ability to control her. "We need to get out of here," Aurora said, her voice gaining strength, her mind racing. "We need to disappear. We need to find a way to fight back." She knew they couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. They were alone, hunted, with nowhere to turn. They had to rely on themselves, on their own wits, on their own courage. "We will," Tommaso said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "We'll find a way. We'll survive this. Together." He helped her to sit up, supporting her weight, his touch gentle, his movements protective. He helped her to dress, to prepare for their escape. As they were about to leave, Aurora noticed something on the floor, near the fireplace. A small, silver object, glinting in the dim light. She picked it up, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a locket, a delicate piece of jewelry, intricately carved, with a small, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the surface, a single, stylized rose. The same symbol she had seen on the key to the villa in Siena. The same symbol she had seen on Leonardo's ring. The same symbol of the Benedetti family. But this locket was different. It was newer, shinier, with a faint inscription on the back, DM to AD Donatella Moretti to Aurora Derossi. Aurora's mind reeled, her heart aching with a sudden, devastating realization. Donatella hadn't tried to kill her. She had protected her. The knife hadn't been meant to kill, but to wound. To create the illusion of an attack, to convince Tommaso that she was in danger, to force him to flee, to take her to a safe place. Donatella had known about the threat, had anticipated the attack, had orchestrated the entire scenario. She had used them, manipulated them, played them like pawns. But she had also saved them.
Why?
What was her game? What was her ultimate goal? Aurora didn't know. But she knew one thing. Donatella Moretti was not who she seemed. She was a master manipulator, a ruthless strategist, a dangerous enigma. And they were caught in her web, entangled in her intricate game, with no way out, except to play along, to learn her rules, to anticipate her moves, to survive. She slipped the locket into her pocket, her fingers closing around it tightly. It was a clue, a message, a warning. She looked at Tommaso, her eyes filled with a newfound understanding, a chilling realization. "We're not running. Tommaso," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We're playing her game, and we're going to win. Their illusions were shattered, but a new, more dangerous reality had taken its place. And this time they had no one to turn to except each other. The question was, how? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The realization that they were pawns in Donatella Moretti's intricate game had shifted the landscape, transforming them from fugitives into reluctant players. Aurora's resolve hardened, fueled by a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a fierce determination to survive, to outwit their manipulative puppet master. We need to understand her motives, Aurora said, her voice low and intense, as Tommaso drove them away from the hunting lodge, back towards the treacherous heart of Florence. We need to know what she wants, what her ultimate goal is. Tommaso nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. She's consolidating power, he said, his voice grim. She's eliminating rivals, silencing threats, expanding her influence. But why us? Aurora asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Why save us? Why orchestrate this elaborate charade? We're a means to an end, Tommaso replied, his eyes scanning the road, alert for any sign of pursuit. We have something she wants. The journal. Our knowledge. Our connections. Or, Aurora said, a chilling thought creeping into her mind, she wants you. Your loyalty. Your service. She wants you in her debt. Tommaso's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a flicker of anger. He knew Aurora was right. Donatella had manipulated him, had used his love for Aurora, his desire for revenge, to control him. We need to find a way to break free, Aurora said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. We need to find a way to turn the tables. They decided to return to Florence, to confront Donatella, to challenge her, to expose her. It was a risky move, a dangerous gamble. But they had nothing left to lose. They reached the city, the familiar streets and buildings now seeming alien, hostile, filled with hidden dangers. They parked the car in a discreet location, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the shadows. They made their way to a small, unassuming apartment, a safe house Tommaso had used in the past, a place known only to him. It was sparsely furnished, but clean and secure, with multiple escape routes, hidden passages, a sanctuary from the prying eyes of their enemies. They spent the next few hours planning, strategizing, preparing for their final confrontation. They reviewed the contents of the journal, identifying key players, outlining the evidence, crafting their narrative. They also contacted Isabella, using a secure line, informing her of Leonardo's death, of Donatella's treachery, of their plan. Isabella, her voice filled with grief and anger, pledged her support, her loyalty, her willingness to help. She was a valuable ally, a source of information, a connection to the underworld, a weapon in their arsenal. As night fell, they prepared to leave, to face Donatella, to end the game. Tommaso armed himself, checking his weapons, his movements swift and efficient, his face a mask of grim determination. Aurora, despite her injury, insisted on accompanying him, her resolve unwavering, her spirit unbroken. She had come too far, endured too much, to be left behind. We do this together, she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. We finish this. Together. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and love. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time, by sorrow, by strength. Whatever happens, he said, his voice low, his gaze intense. I want you to know I never stopped loving you, Aurora. I never will. She met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And I never stopped loving you, Tommaso, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They embraced, a brief, desperate moment of connection, of solace, before the storm. Then, they stepped out into the night, ready to face their destiny. They arrived at the Moretti Villa, a sprawling, opulent mansion, surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed men. They were expected. Donatella was waiting. They were ushered inside, led through the grand, echoing hallways, to the same salon where they had met before. The fire was burning brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of both warmth and menace. Donatella stood before the fireplace, her back to them, her figure silhouetted against the flames. She turned as they entered, her eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating intelligence. "You have returned," she said, her voice smooth, her lips forming a faint, cruel smile. "I trust you have considered my offer." "We have," Tommaso said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "And we decline." Donatella's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You dare?" she said, her voice laced with a hint of menace. "We know the truth," Donatella, Aurora said, stepping forward, her voice clear and strong. "We know about your manipulations. We know about your lies. We know about your game." She held up the locket, the silver rose glinting in the firelight.
"You didn't try to kill me," she said. "You protected me.
You orchestrated the attack. You used us." Donatella's expression remained unchanged, her face a mask of impassivity. "Clever, Signora de Rossi," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But irrelevant." "It's over, Donatella," Tommaso said, his voice rising in intensity. "We're not your pawns. We're not your puppets. We're taking control." He gestured towards the windows, towards the doors, towards the hidden passages that he knew existed within the villa.
"We have allies," he said.
"We have support. We have the truth." Donatella laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent a chill down Aurora's spine. "You think you can defeat me?" she said, her voice filled with a mocking amusement. "You think you can challenge me? In my own home?" "We're not afraid of you, Donatella," Aurora said, her voice unwavering. "We're not afraid of your threats. We're not afraid of your power." She stepped closer, her eyes locked on Donatella's, her voice filled with a fierce determination.
"We're going to expose you," she said.
"We're going to reveal your crimes. We're going to bring you down." Donatella's gaze flickered, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, crossing her face. She had underestimated them. She had underestimated their courage, their resolve, their love. She had made a mistake. A tense standoff ensued, a battle of wills, a clash of hearts, a final confrontation. The air crackled with tension, with unspoken threats, with the weight of their shared history. But before either side could make a move, a sudden commotion erupted outside the villa. Gunfire, shouting, chaos. Donatella's men rushed into the salon, their faces panicked, their weapons drawn. "We're under attack," one of them cried. "Salviati's men. They're everywhere." The final confrontation had arrived, but not in the way anyone had expected. The carefully constructed plans, the intricate manipulations, the delicate balance of power had all been shattered by a single, unpredictable event. The game had changed, and the outcome was uncertain. Donatella cursed and turned, a snarl twisting her face. Who would dare? Epilogue. The chaos of the Salviati attack threw everything into disarray. Donatella's carefully constructed plans, her intricate manipulations, crumbled in the face of the sudden, brutal assault. The villa, once a symbol of power and control, became a battleground, a scene of violence and destruction. Tommaso and Aurora, caught in the crossfire, fought side by side, their love and loyalty a shield against the onslaught. They moved with a practiced ease, a synchronicity born of shared danger and a deep, abiding connection. They were no longer pawns, but warriors, fighting for their survival, for their future. Donatella, her composure shattered, her authority undermined, fought with a desperate ferocity, her eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and fear. She had underestimated her enemies, had overestimated her own control. She was losing. The battle raged throughout the villa, gunfire echoing through the halls, shattering the silence, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Allies and enemies clashed, loyalties were tested, and the lines between good and evil blurred. In the midst of the chaos, Aurora found herself face to face with the leader of the Salviati attack, the man who had orchestrated her stabbing, the man who had hunted them relentlessly. He was young, ruthless, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. He raised his weapon, aiming it at Aurora, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, and he crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Tommaso stood behind him, his gun smoking, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had saved her, again. The tide of the battle turned. The Salviati forces, their leader dead, their attack faltering, were overwhelmed by Donatella's men, reinforced by the unexpected arrival of Isabella and a small, but fiercely loyal, contingent of fighters. Isabella, her face etched with grief and determination, fought with a surprising ferocity, her years of quiet desperation channeled into a righteous anger. She had lost Leonardo, but she would not lose this fight. The Salviati attack was repelled, their forces scattered, their threat eliminated. The villa, though damaged, remained standing, a testament to the resilience of its defenders. Donatella, her power diminished, her reputation tarnished, was forced to concede defeat. She had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, outplayed. She had lost. In the aftermath of the battle, a new order emerged. The old alliances, the old rivalries, were shattered, replaced by a fragile peace, a tentative truce. Tommaso and Aurora, their love tested and strengthened by the fires of adversity, emerged as leaders, as figures of respect and authority. They had earned their place, their power, through courage, through loyalty, through sacrifice. They used their influence to expose Lorenzo's crimes, to bring his remaining allies to justice, to heal the wounds of the past. They worked to create a new world, a world where honor and loyalty were valued above power and greed, a world where love could flourish, free from the shadows of betrayal and violence. Isabella, her grief slowly healing, found a new purpose, a new sense of belonging. She became a trusted advisor, a confidant, a friend. She had lost her love, but she had found a family. Donatella, stripped of her power, her influence, disappeared from the scene, retreating into the shadows, her fate unknown. She had been defeated, but not destroyed. She remained a threat, a potential enemy, a reminder of the constant vigilance required to maintain peace. Tommaso and Aurora, their hands clasped together, stood on the balcony of the Benedetti villa, overlooking the city of Florence, bathed in the golden light of a new dawn. They had survived. They had triumphed. They had found their way back to each other. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the pain they had endured, of the sacrifices they had made. But they were also a testament to their strength, their resilience, their love. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. They had fought for their future, and they had won. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a deep, abiding love, a love that had been tested by fire, a love that had endured, a love that would last a lifetime. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale castle, but in the heart of a dangerous, beautiful, and unforgiving world. It was a love forged in fire, tempered by adversity, and strengthened by unwavering loyalty. It was a love that would conquer all. They knew it would not be easy. But they also knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they could face any challenge, as long as they had each other. They kissed. The end.